Hi, I'm Andrew Liang, and this is a special spring installment of our speaker series. We are pleased to be joined today by George Shultz, here at the Hoover Institution on the campus of Stanford University, where he is a distinguished fellow. Secretary Shultz is a Marine, an economist, and a statesman, and one of our nation's greatest public servants. He has served as an economist with President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors, as Secretary of Labor, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and Secretary of the Treasury under President Nixon, and then as Secretary of State for 7 years in the Reagan Administration. Secretary Shultz has also served as the President of Bechtel and the Dean of the University of Chicago Business School. He is the recipient of a Presidential Medal of Freedom. We're going to talk to him about his career, his advocacy on important issues like climate change, and his advice to students today. Secretary Shultz, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I want to start by talking about your path into public service. So after you graduated from MIT, what did you want to do with your life?
Well, I decided I'd studied economics. I decided was interested in that subject. So I got a PhD in economics. And I want to teach and do research on the subject. And if I ever had an opportunity to work in the government, I would welcome that. So that was my idea of a career.
So you're a professor at MIT in the 50s. So how did you become a part of the economic team working with President Eisenhower?
The way the Council of Economic Advisors is set up, they have people who come mostly from university economics departments come and fill certain slots. My field was labor economics. So one of my good friends was a man named Al Reese, who had that slot. And I guess he must have recommended that his replacement, who was only there a year, would be me, and I interviewed and got the job.
As a professor, what kind of student did you enjoy teaching the most?
Well, you enjoy students students at a place like MIT they're all smart. They wouldn't be there. But you like students who get engrossed in the subject and want to understand it at a deeper level than just knowing things. They realize some of the depth of economics. For instance, economics is essentially a strategy science. Because there are all kinds of examples where you do something here and nothing happens except with a lag. So you have to think strategically. And you get that lesson into you from working economics, and it applies to everything else. You have to have a strategy.
And who was the most important mentor that you had early on in your career?
Well, my father was a great guy, and he played catch with me endlessly. And then when I was growing up, he didn't have a 5-day week, he had a 5.5-day week. So on Saturdays, I was not at school. He would often take me with him. And so I'd do things around the office. Then we go to, I can remember today, the P&G sandwich shop. They had the Beck's 3-decker sandwiches. But he had a PhD from Columbia University. So I'd often go up to Columbia to a football game or something, or if there was an interesting lecture or something like that, we'd go to that. So I spent a lot of time with my father, and he was a great pal.
What was the most important lesson that you took from your father in your career?
Well, my father was a hard worker, and he wanted to do things that were worthwhile. And he made a good living, but that wasn't what he was mainly. I mean, he had to do that. But he wanted to do something that was worth doing. So he started a school. It was called the School of Wall Street. It was sponsored by the New York Stock Exchange, but he developed it into a school that told clerks how you do that kind of job. But then it became also a place where they taught security analysis and wealth management and things like that.
And you're an economist. At that point, how did the economic views of Milton Friedman influence you later on as a cabinet secretary in the Nixon administration?
Well, Milton was a great friend and a tremendous intellect and economist. So I frequently called him when I was in office and talked things over with him. Here's an example. When I was director of the management and budget, President Nixon, against my advice, instituted wage and price controls. It was not in my bailiwick, but I was against it. Then I became Secretary of the Treasury, and then they report to me. And worrying about the exchange rate system reports to me. And I kept asking when I was in OMB, what was their plan? And they always said it was a secret. So I said, well, okay, now I'm secretary, what's the plan? They said, we don't have one. I said, that's what I thought. So we developed one. And I had a lot of conversation with Milton about it, because we both felt that the world would be better off if we had a more or less floating system. But most of the Europeans and the Japanese, who were very influential, wanted something more managed. It was called a par value system. So we designed a floating exchange rate system in the clothing of a par value system. Very clever. And what we said was, you have par values, but they change automatically when your reserve level changes. So it was a good proposal and an example of something where Milton was not only a gifted economist, but he had a practical sense to him. He would figure out ways to do things.
And you would seek him out for advice.
Yeah.
What kind of leader was President Nixon?
President Nixon was a strategist. And if you came to him with something that was tactical, he really wasn't in. He wanted a strategy. What is this all about in the long run? So I'll give you two examples. I had the view when I was a professor at the University of Chicago that in the presidencies of Kennedy and Johnson, they intervened too much in labor disputes. They would claim that if there was a strike, it would disrupt the economy. So they'd intervene and bring people to the White House. And I said, first of all, most of them were not national emergencies. And second of all, they were totally messing up the private system of bargaining. Because if you know you're going to the White House, you don't make your best offer till you get there, right? So that dries up. So in somewhere around October, I think, of 1968, a strike started on the eastern Gulf Coast of the Longshoremen. And President Johnson decided under Taft-Hartley that it was would create a national emergency. So he enjoined the strike. There's a fast-track appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed with the president. So the injunction held and expired in the middle of January sometime. And I'm sworn in as Secretary of Labor on January 21st. So the press said, okay, Professor Shultz, now you're Secretary of Labor. What are you going to do? So I went to President Nixon, and I explained what was happening to the process of collective bargaining and why, and said this dispute will create a lot of kerfuffle in New York City. But beyond that, it can work out. It's not a national emergency. Your predecessor was wrong. The Supreme Court was wrong. And if you will hang tough with me and not intervene, as soon as the parties are clear in their mind they're not coming to the White House, then we can get this mediated out and get it settled, and we'll send a big long-term message. And he agreed, and he stood up to it. The governor came of New York, this mayor came, the senators came, they all wanted him to intervene, and he didn't. And it worked out more or less the way I said. So he had some confidence in me as a result of that. But it was he took a strategic point of view.
So why did you decide to resign as Treasury Secretary?
Because then I had the apparatus of the wage and price control system reporting to me. And against my advice, I had been trying to get rid of them. Against my advice, he reinstituted them. And I said, well, Mr. President, this is right in my area. It's your call, but I don't agree with it. So you got to find yourself a new Secretary of the Treasury. I think in these jobs, they're very elevating in many ways, but you can't want the job too much. You have to have your own views of what is right. And on something really important, if it doesn't go your way, you should get out of the way.